Most people think Ealing Studios made comedies, but before they gave us Alec Guinness and caper heists, Michael Balcon's team was making the grittiest, most brutal war propaganda Britain ever produced. Did you know Ealing's films were so violent that modern audiences still find them shocking? Here are the war films that steeled British resolve when invasion felt inevitable. 1. Went the Day Well, 1942. Alberto Cavalcanti's masterpiece is basically where Ealing went to war and refused to pull punches. Based on a Graham Greene story, this film depicts German paratroopers infiltrating an English village disguised as Royal Engineers. What makes it absolutely brutal is how the villagers fight back with whatever they find, including a woman with a hatchet. This isn't your grandmother's wartime propaganda, it's a violent, paranoid nightmare that captures the terror of invasion when that threat felt completely real. Made in 1942, when German planes were still circling, the film shocked audiences with its unflinching realism. Cavalcanti was a Brazilian director schooled in surrealism and documentary, so he brought this weird outsider sensibility to very British material. The genius move was framing the entire story as a flashback from a victorious post-war Britain talking about defeating a full-scale invasion. It was morale-boosting, but not sentimental. Women execute Nazis. An old lady shoots a fifth columnist. People actually died defending their village. The British Board of Censors nearly had a fit. Diana Morgan, Ealing's only female staff writer at the time, co-wrote it and brought authentic details to how ordinary people would actually respond to occupation. The score by William Walton is haunting. 2. The Cruel Sea, 1953. Jack Hawkins becomes an absolute legend with this post-war naval masterpiece about the Battle of the Atlantic. Ealing waited 8 years after the war ended to make this film. But when director Charles Friend finally adapted Nicholas Montserrat's best-selling novel, he created something that World War II historian James Holland called the most realistic war movie he'd ever seen. That's coming from a guy who studies actual battles. Hawkins plays Lieutenant Commander Erickson, a reserve officer tasked with commanding HMS Compass Rose, a tiny escort corvette bouncing around the deadly North Atlantic hunting U-boats. What kills about this film is how it refuses to make war seem glorious. There's no heroic music swelling. There's just men freezing in freezing water, making impossible decisions, and watching comrades drown. The most traumatic scene involves Erickson spotting survivors from a sunken ship in the water, but a submarine is directly beneath them. He drops depth charges, killing the enemy but also his own men. Hawkins delivers a performance of raw emotional weight, then drinks himself paralyzed that night. Michael Balcon literally asked Charles Friend to reshoot it because Hawkins was too emotional, then asked him to reshoot it. Again, because not enough emotion was wrong. In the final version, that first take made it through. Jack Hawkins himself wrote in his autobiography that all the cast felt they were making something unusually honest, nothing like typical Hollywood war films. 3. San Demetrio London, 1943. Charles Friend and Robert Hamer directed this absolute gem based on true events. In 1940, the British tanker MV San Demetrio got shelled by the German heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer and abandoned, burning in the Atlantic. Then weeks later, some of the crew who drifted in lifeboats spotted their ship still afloat, reboarded the burning wreck, and actually brought it home. This sounds like Hollywood fiction, but it's real. Ealing made it just a year after the war, when the wounds were still open. The film strips everything down to its essence. No fancy Hollywood melodrama, just men who decide their chances are better aboard a flaming ship than in lifeboats on the open ocean. The second officer and engineering chief take command, put out the fires, restart the engines, and sail toward home. Ealing showed that heroism doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It's quiet, methodical, and mostly just people doing their job because someone has to. The cast includes young Gordon Jackson in early work, Mervyn Johns as a stoic greaser who sacrifices himself repeatedly without complaint, and a Canadian playing an American playing British. The film actually explores how diverse crews bond under impossible stress, how class and nationality dissolve when the ship is on fire. 4. The Foreman Went to France, 1942. Based on the true story of Welsh munitions worker Melbourne Johns, this film follows a factory foreman who decides his bosses aren't moving fast enough to save British machinery from France before the Nazis arrive, so he goes himself. Director Charles Friend tones down the propaganda just enough to make you forget you're watching it, which is exactly the skill Ealing needed. The film stars Clifford Evans as the earnest foreman, Constance Cummings as an American secretary, and a young Gordon Jackson in his film debut. Tommy Trinder adds comic relief as a soldier, but even he's restrained here, which is shocking. What makes this film fascinating is that it's basically a road movie through occupied France in 1940. The group dodges German planes, encounters fifth columnists everywhere, and realizes nobody in authority can be trusted. The propaganda message is buried so deep you almost don't see it hitting you. The foreman trusts officials who betray him, mirrors how unaware Britain was of the danger right in front of it. There's a scene of refugees being strafed by German fighters, with children screaming and planes diving into frame that uses editing sharp enough to rival Eisenstein. A nun dies in the attack. Someone gets shot. This is wartime propaganda that actually shows the horror. Michael Balcon produced it with War Office support, making it technically official messaging. But the film never feels like a lecture. 5. For Those in Peril, 1944. Charles Crichton directed this lean, muscular film about an air-sea rescue crew risking death to retrieve downed RAF pilots from the English Channel. What's remarkable is how completely unstaged it feels. There's no orchestral swelling, no unnecessary drama, just men in a rescue boat deciding to save other men, whatever the cost. The title comes from the old hymn, Eternal Father, Strong to Save, about sailors in danger. And there's something almost sacred about how Crichton treats the material. The cast features an entirely male universe. These aren't actors playing soldiers, they're crew members bound together in the tightest spaces, and rank dissolves as quickly as it needs to. Cinematographer Douglas Slocum shot splendid maritime sequences that make the sea feel like a living character. The rescue sequences aren't action spectacles. They're meticulous, dangerous, and completely unglamorous. Men are cold, wet, scared, and focused. When someone makes a wrong move, there's real consequence. Ealing made this documentary-style war propaganda, but refused to make it feel propagandistic. The heroism emerges from the work itself, not from speeches. 6. The Captive Heart, 1946. Basil Dearden directed this post-war drama about British prisoners in a German concentration camp, and it's essentially a melodrama told in flashback. Michael Redgrave plays a British officer who's kept a secret from his fellow prisoners that will have profound consequences when they're finally liberated. What makes the film work is that Dearden treats it as a story about invisible wounds, not just about physical imprisonment, but about how people maintain their humanity when everything is stripped away. The ensemble cast of prisoners all carry stories nobody knows. They have wives, mothers, sweethearts waiting back home, but they're trapped in a shrinking world where time becomes meaningless. The film explores how these men bond in captivity, how they support each other through crushing boredom and constant fear. Redgrave's performance carries a secret weight. His character isn't the obvious action hero. He's a man trapped by his own choices, unable to tell the truth even to people who've become his brothers. The film shows how war doesn't just happen to people on battlefields, it happens to people in camps, in offices, in homes, waiting for news that might never arrive. 7. The Overlanders, 1946. Harry Watt directed this Australian western that Michael Balcon sent halfway around the world to film. With German invasion threatening Australia from across the Pacific, a massive cattle drive happens across the barren northern territories to save the herds from possible Japanese capture. This is Ealing doing an actual western, filmed on location under brutal heat, which makes it feel completely different from their British studio output. The heterogeneous group driving the cattle across impossible terrain becomes increasingly Ealing despite the landscape. Jack Lee directs with an epic sensibility that respects the raw country they're moving through. The cattle become almost as important as the people, which is the whole point. These aren't soldiers fighting enemy troops, they're workers preserving the nation's resources because someone has to. Watt had previously worked as a documentary filmmaker, so he brings that observational reality to what could have been just a cattle drive adventure. The Australian landscape becomes a character itself, beautiful and brutal, testing the men constantly. Class dissolves as it always does in Ealing films when people face something larger than themselves. 8. The Bells Go Down, 1943. This film follows London firefighters during the Blitz, and Tommy Trinder somehow manages to give a genuinely good performance. Ealing made this between August 1939 and September 1940, when London was actually under aerial bombardment. There's something almost surreal about watching a film about the Blitz that was made while the Blitz was happening. The contemporary audiences saw themselves in it instantly. These weren't soldiers, they were firefighters, which meant they were neighbors. The ensemble cast shows different kinds of courage, different ways people respond when their city is being incinerated. Trinder's usual music hall persona is carefully restrained, making him more touching. The firefighters aren't issuing brave speeches, they're just showing up every shift knowing their station might be next. Ealing captures the camaraderie that forms when people work together under constant danger. The Blitz sequences are genuinely harrowing, filmed in black and white that makes everything feel more immediate. Fire, Smoke, darkness, and the sound of explosions create an immersive chaos that's terrifying. 9. Undercover, 1943. This Yugoslav resistance drama follows a small group fighting German occupation. Ealing made this with support from exile governments and the Free Nations Committee, which means it's propaganda for a cause most British audiences couldn't quite grasp. Sergei Nalbandov directed, bringing Eastern European sensibility to Ealing's particular brand of understatement. The resistance fighters aren't Hollywood commandos, they're ordinary people making desperate choices. What distinguishes the film is its internationalism. Ealing understood that the war wasn't just a British matter, it was global. The Yugoslav resistance fight is presented with the same documentary realism that Ealing brought to British stories. The terrain is harsh, supplies are limited, and the stakes are existential. The film doesn't condescend to audiences by explaining too much about politics or history. It just shows people choosing resistance over submission. Nalbandov keeps the emotional register subdued, which makes the violence more shocking when it arrives. 10. Johnny Frenchman, 1945. Charles Friend directed this wartime drama about rivalry and cooperation between British and French fishermen working in the Channel. It's a smaller-scale story than some of Ealing's other war efforts, focused on how men from neighboring countries overcome prejudice and personal animosity when facing a common enemy. The fishing community becomes a microcosm for how unity develops when there's no other choice. The title character is a French fisherman whose boat symbolizes the alliance itself. Personal grudges matter less when German submarines are hunting, but Ealing doesn't pretend those grudges simply evaporate. They persist alongside the cooperation. The film shows how practical necessity forces people to work together even when they'd prefer not to. It's a quiet film, mostly set on boats and in villages, with sudden explosions of danger reminding everyone what they're actually fighting. The humor is dryly British, the drama restrained. Friend was one of Ealing's best directors, and Johnny Frenchman shows his understanding of how communities function under pressure. People don't become different versions of themselves just because war arrives. They remain petty, stubborn, occasionally noble, and deeply human. The film credits suggest peace will take more work than winning the war, because the old resentments will still exist when the danger passes. That's a remarkably unsentimental vision from a wartime propaganda film. It suggests that victory means nothing if people haven't learned to genuinely respect each other. That's what made Ealing Studios different from most war propaganda. They were always thinking about what comes after. 11. Painted Boats, 1945. Charles Crichton directed this film about a barge woman taking over her husband's operation on the British canal system. It's remarkable because it makes the inland waterways matter to the war effort. These boats transport supplies, coal, ammunition, everything that keeps Britain functioning. A woman running a barge isn't as dramatic as a pilot or a soldier, but it's essential. Ealing understood that war wasn't fought just on battlefields, it was fought through logistics and labor. The film treats waterways with the respect usually reserved for grand naval operations. The boats, the locks, the constant physical work become as important as any battle. The woman protagonist is practical rather than heroic, competent rather than exceptional. She does her job because it needs doing, and if that sounds simple, it's actually revolutionary for wartime cinema. Ealing was telling audiences that keeping the economy functioning mattered. Keeping supplies moving mattered. Every job performed well mattered. No job was too small to be war work. Crichton's visual sense emphasizes the beauty in ordinary water and boats. He makes the canal system feel like a lifeline stretching across Britain. When German planes attack, the vulnerability of these waterways becomes apparent, but the woman captain recovers and continues. That's the message. Disruption is temporary, but the work is eternal. This is wartime propaganda aimed at people doing unglamorous work, telling them they're heroes even if they never see combat. That's both manipulative and genuinely moving. 12. 9 Men, 1943. Harry Watt directed this desert warfare tale about 9 soldiers in North Africa trying to hold a position against overwhelming German forces. It's another unremarkable title covering a story about small unit resilience. The 9 men aren't named individually. They're just soldiers. The film refuses to make them distinct characters with personal backstories. They're a unit, and the unit is what matters. That's a radically different approach from American films, which would have given each man a family to write letters to or a girl waiting back home. The desert landscape becomes almost as much an enemy as the Germans. Heat, sand, exhaustion, and isolation test the men as much as combat. Watt's documentary background shows and how he frames the terrain. It's beautiful and deadly. The men make decisions together, trust each other implicitly, and accept that most of them probably won't survive. It's a quiet heroism, not grandiose, but absolutely committed. When they finally get overrun, it's presented matter-of-factly. War destroys people. Ealing wasn't interested in sugarcoating that. This is Ealing at its most documentary-like, most restrained, most committed to showing actual warfare rather than movie warfare. The battles aren't spectacular. They're chaotic, confused, and brutal. Men die. The unit keeps functioning. Then the unit is destroyed. It's anticlimactic and profound. Watt understood that battles aren't resolved through individual heroism or clever tactics. They're determined by how many bodies you can throw at the problem and how much punishment those bodies can sustain. That's grim but honest propaganda. 13. They Came to a City, 1944. Basil Dearden adapted a J.B. Priestley play for this symbolic drama about people from different social classes mysteriously arriving at an ideal city. It's the most abstract of Ealing's war films, almost more like science fiction than conventional propaganda. The city is a utopia, a harmonious society built on cooperation and equality. Different people react differently to it based on their class backgrounds and assumptions. It becomes a debate about what Britain should be after the war. This is Ealing getting philosophical. While battles rage, filmmakers were already asking what would replace the old order. The film suggests that ordinary people might choose to build something more just. Characters from aristocracy to working class encounter this city and must decide if they want to stay. It's propaganda with a radical edge, suggesting that class barriers might dissolve when people see what's actually possible. For 1944, that's genuinely controversial. The film is dialogue-heavy and abstract, which makes it less immediately gripping than Ealing's action-based war dramas, but it's essential to understanding the studio's vision. Priestley was a major British intellectual, and his influence shows. This isn't just about winning the war, it's about building a society that justifies the sacrifice. The film trusts audiences to follow philosophical arguments without hand-holding. It's ambitious and uncompromising. Not every Ealing war film needed explosions or combat sequences. Some just needed to show people thinking about the future they'd fight for. 14. Frida, 1947. Basil Dearden made this post-war drama about a British soldier who marries a German woman and brings her home to a deeply suspicious community. The marriage itself is an act of defiance against the hatred and suspicion the war created. It's about how individuals try to build bridges when societies are still burning. The film could have been sentimental, but Dearden makes it genuinely challenging. Many townspeople hate the woman simply for being German, regardless of her actual beliefs or actions. The post-war films are often less interesting than the wartime ones, but Frida stands with the best of them. It argues that peace requires forgiveness and individual choice against community prejudice. The woman isn't presented as exceptional or noble. She's just a woman trying to live a normal life in a place that's decided she's the enemy. The film shows how prejudice operates, how it justifies itself, how it's nearly impossible to overcome through individual acts of courage. It's bleak and necessary. Dearden understood that the war didn't end when Germany surrendered. It ended when people like this couple convinced others that the enemy was also human. That's not easy propaganda to make. You're asking audiences to sympathize with Germans when the war wounds are still fresh, but Ealing trusted that its audience was capable of moral complexity. Frida suggests that the next generation might do better than the old order of national hatreds. That's radical hope, not naive optimism. 15. Against the Wind, 1948. Basil Dearden directed this final Ealing war film about a British agent organizing resistance in occupied Europe. It's one of the later efforts, made after the war had definitely ended, so it's working with hindsight. The film shows resistance work as exhausting, dangerous, psychologically crushing work with minimal reward. People are captured, tortured, executed. The victories are small, the defeats crushing, but the work continues because giving up means accepting tyranny. This is Ealing at its most mature, most willing to acknowledge that the war's legacy isn't tidy victory but complicated survival. The agent protagonist is tired, morally compromised by the decisions he's forced to make, and increasingly detached from his own mission. He's heroic not because he's exceptional, but because he continues despite knowing the costs. The European settings feel authentic. The other resistance fighters are portrayed as genuinely human rather than heroic types. Against the Wind closes the books on Ealing's war period. The studio would make comedies and crime dramas after this, but the war had transformed how Ealing understood storytelling. They'd learned to trust audiences with ambiguity, moral complexity, and unhappy endings. They'd proven that propaganda didn't require lies, just unflinching honesty about the stakes. Against the Wind reminds us that when Ealing finally stopped making war films, they'd raised the form to an art. So here's the real question. Are these dusty, black and white British films actually better than the cinematic war spectacles we get today with massive budgets and CGI? Can modern audiences handle war films that don't give them clear heroes to root for? Which of these Ealing pictures would you actually watch? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let's start a proper debate.